mouth in the issues of the first waves. Now they decide we're going to hit the truckers with a mandate. No data to back it up, no reason it seems apart from politicking. Now getting to the point where we are here now with the crisis happening out in Ottawa, some might think that the tipping point was the Prime Minister in September, but it being reported in January calling the unvaccinated racists, misogynists, and extremists. When the Prime Minister asked, should we tolerate these people? Pitting Canadian against Canadian. But I think the roots of what is happening across Canada and happening outside here of this place, it goes back to the election. July 13th, the Prime Minister stated there would be no vaccine mandates. July 13th. 2 weeks later, when he called the unnecessary, unneeded election, he finds out through internal polling that, hey, this is a wedge issue. We can wedge Canadian against Canadian. We can wedge the electorate against the Conservatives by flip-flopping and bringing in vaccine mandates and making it the prime election issue. And it's quite funny listening to the other side, especially the finance minister, calling Conservatives a party of flip-flop. Now, this country has had a number of distinguished finance ministers. Paul Martin, Jim Flaherty, Michael Wilson. Can you imagine any of these distinguished and fine finance ministers reducing themselves to name-calling of the party of flip-flops like the current one? But that seems to be the modus operandi of this government. Now, during the election, we've never seen the protests like we had caused by this government. We've never had people out shamefully throwing rocks, pebbles at a prime minister until this government purposely wedged Canadians against Canadians. Now we understand vaccines are important, we all know that, but pitting Canadians against unvaccinated Canadians for political gain is wrong, and it has led to what's happened outside. Now, I have been doing this game for a long time. I've actually started my political volunteering with a gentleman named Chuck Cook, who was the Member of Parliament for North Vancouver and was the whip at one time for the Mulroney government. I helped out as a youth delegate alternate for Joe Clark, losing unfortunately. I campaigned from Victoria to Newfoundland, knocking on doors. And I've never seen such anger, so many Canadians turned against each other as they have because of this government, turning one group against the other. I once actually even door-knocked in the by-election in Davenport after Jack Layton had passed away. And I've never in my life seen a campaign. Every single house had an orange sign throughout the entire riding. The support was amazing. But as a Conservative, I was able to door-knock there with none of the vitriol that we saw in the last election. Again, caused by this Prime Minister pitting Canadian against Canadian, wondering if we should tolerate other Canadians who haven't been vaccinated. Now, when the truckers announced they were coming to town, the Prime Minister, I think, thought he could just demonize them like he did with other protests. Call them names and they would simply go away. But they didn't. The Prime Minister riled them up. Again, instead of discussing the issue, instead of debating it in the House, he called them names. He created the conditions and the anger, and that stuck in Canada. Now, when we had rail protests a couple of years ago, crippling the economy, Port of Vancouver blockaded, the situation in Quebec, the lack of fuel was so bad, Canadian Albertan companies were talking about, heaven forbid, a convoy to bring propane to keep Quebecers heated. Now, what did the Prime Minister do? Did he call them names? These are protesters who were throwing furniture in front of moving trains, hoping to derail them. Did he call them names? Of course not. He actually hurried and sent ministers out to negotiate. This is not a national emergency, as much as the other side will claim. This is a political emergency for the Prime Minister. The Act itself, since 1988, we think of all the crises Canada has faced, and there have been a lot. Some major, some not as much. But we had OCA. I remember OCA, Army was there against people with AK-47s, solved without the Emergency Act. Caledonia, again, the protests 2 years ago with the rail blockades. The G20, where we had over 1,000 arrests, violence in the streets, storefronts destroyed, was not a national emergency. 1997, if we remember Vancouver during APEC, famously when the RCMP pepper sprayed protesters, and Prime Minister Chrystia talked about, well, pepper is something to put on a steak. People don't realize the RCMP had feared for protesters' lives because the government for the first time allowed 8 different nations to have armed security with their leaders. Now, I'm not worried about when Bush was here with the U.S. being armed, but President Suharto, strongman thug from Indonesia at the time, had armed security with them. The RCMP stated they were afraid Suharto's thugs would fire into the crowd and kill Canadians. But that was not an emergency under the Act. Coastal GasLink, which we just saw, where people broke in, actually tried to light a car on fire that actually had workers inside, broke in with axes, millions of dollars of equipment, and when the police were attending, ambushed the police, throwing burning items at the police cars. But apparently that is not an emergency. I wonder if the government is actually going to try to see some bank accounts of those supporting such things. Are the Liberals going to investigate that? Of course not, because certain ideological protests are more apparently fair than others. Now, the Liberals will try their best to trot out the various reasons that this is a national emergency. They're trying to claim, as we heard earlier in one of my interventions, that these people were trying to overthrow the government. No, seriously, as if the hot tub time machine guys out there with a ludicrous online demand to overthrow the government is to be taken seriously. Or the people calling in saying, have the Governor General replace the Prime Minister. That is not a serious issue. Perhaps bringing out Prime Minister Harper at the time and beheading him on the lawn of this place like the Toronto 18 could be considered an emergency. But again, I don't think the bouncy council people are anything that constitutes an emergency. Earlier, when this first came up, I was responding or asking a question, and I was being heckled by one of the Liberals. I asked, why were they able to clear Windsor, Surrey, and the other border crossings without the Emergency Act? Why do we need it? And the Liberal MP yelled across, they might come back. So I have to ask, when will this actually end for the Liberal government? When will their political emergency end? If the government is saying secretly, well, maybe they'll come back and we'll keep it going. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals are not justified in any way the use of the Emergency Act. That's why I will not be supporting it. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague from Edmonton West for his intervention, and I must profoundly disagree with many of the premises of his statement, but I do want to kind of probe into one issue that's really come forth, which is the financing of these protests. One report says that 1,100 of the donors to this protest were the same as the January 6th Capitol Hill riots donors, and of course there's been a lot written about them and the motivations there. We also see the protesters here with very hateful flags, hateful symbols, reports of shelters being overtaken and so on. So if you could maybe our colleague opposite can talk about the funding that's there and what kind of impact, and if he's worried about the funding on Canada's political system and what kind of impact.
The honourable member for Edmonton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my colleague. It's an honor to get a question from him. I find it quite, I appreciate the comment, and I don't want to be mean back, but, I appreciate what he's saying. I am kind of stunned, though, The U.S. Treasury, their version of our Treasury Board investigation found that Tides USA was being funded, or money from Russia was being funneled into Tides USA, and that money was getting funneled into Canada. We knew about this, government knew about that, and yet did nothing. Millions and millions funneled in through other environmental groups to fight development in Alberta. Probably the Coastal GasLink protests. I have to be curious, why are those okay? But again, bouncy castle donations are not.
Question et commentaire, questions and comments. The honorable member for Alfred Pelham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On February 5th, the Alberta government addressed an official request to the federal government, requesting federal assistance in dealing with border protests, invoking the necessity to intervene, and I cite, in a complex and dynamic situation that continues to impede the free and safe movement of not only Albertans, but also of critical goods and services vital to both the Canadian and American economy. So I ask my colleague, is the Honorable Rick McIver, Minister of Municipal Affairs of Alberta, completely off the track? Or what's good for Albertans is not good for the rest of Canadians?
For Edmonton West.
The member should know what's good for Alberta is good for the rest of the country, as you know from our equalization payments we pay out. I will note, and he should note this as well, and should not mislead the House, Coots was settled without bringing in the Draconian Emergency Act. It was settled using existing police powers, just like in Surrey, just like in Emerson, just like in Windsor, and just like it could have been done here in Ottawa as well.
Questions and comments.
The honourable member. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I greatly appreciated my colleagues' presentation and examples of other demonstrations that seemed much more urgent and yet for which emergency measures were not required. So 3 days earlier, the Prime Minister was saying that the police had all the required tools, and then all of a sudden, the Emergencies Act has to be invoked. Was that not done just to hide the Prime Minister's incompetence?
Mr. Speaker, thank you for it. It's great to see my colleague back here in the House physically. Yes, as I said, this is a political emergency created by this government. It's not a national emergency. We've seen in bigger, more serious issues across the country, both in the past years and the past week. It can be solved with the current powers that the police have. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The honorable member for Port Moody Coquitlam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I have to say I am disappointed to see the dismissive comments made by the member in regards to unlawful activities that have caused a lot of real trauma to Canadians across this country.